So what we're going to talk about for September is, to me, the Constitution month. September is the month where the Constitution, that we celebrate the Constitution and think about the Constitution. And there's not a lot of writing about George Washington's involvement in bringing about that Constitution. We usually hear that from Madison and Hamilton, and we're going to talk about some of that. But it's a really interesting period of George Washington's life. So I've been very happily going through all these letters, all these amazing letters from that period. For anyone out there interested, founders.org, I mean, what a treasure trove. You know, when I was a kid, and even as in college and so forth, if I wanted to read some Hamilton's letters or Washington's letters, I had to find a library that had them, and I had to, you know, and now they're just all there for everybody. So we can all complain about the internet, but it's got its good sides and its bad sides, and the good sides is that all of these letters, you know, I feel bad for people studying, those who are in politics today, who are going to have to read these awful tweets and so forth when they're trying to do it, because I just had this wonderful time reading these letters, which really told the story of George Washington personally in that time, and George Washington politically and in terms of what was going on in the country at the time. And of course, as the person who gives seminars on leadership, I'm looking at this from the leadership aspect and seeing something that I had not really discovered when I looked at this period of George Washington before, and that's this tremendous shift he makes in his leadership style. You know, different leaders come up at different times and are called for in different times. And we all know this as sports fans, right? I mean, we know that the Eagles hired Doug Peterson because he had a different personality from Chip, right? We called it emotional intelligence. He didn't have to be too emotionally intelligent to be better than Chip about that. Low bar. And I'm an old baseball, I'm a big baseball fan, and I always look at, you know, Billy Martin, who is probably the greatest manager ever in terms of taking terrible teams and bringing them straight up to second and then to first place. I mean, nobody ever did that better than he did that. And he'd always be fired by the third year because nobody could stand his leadership style anymore. And I remember in 1978 when he was fired, you may remember he called George Washington a convicted felon, so he got fired for speaking a truth, which you can't do in his position. You know, he said about Reggie, one's a liar and one's convicted. And Bob Lemon comes in. So Bob Lemon's, he's been watching this circus go on. He was the manager of the White Sox, and you know, Thurman Munson isn't catching anymore. He's playing the outfield, which he can't do. They got Mike Heath catching. They got somebody else in shortstop. And Bob Lemon comes up on the first day, and he says to the group of people, he says, well, I don't know, am I wrong? I heard you guys won the World Series last year. Is that true? And they kind of smile, and one of them says, yeah, that's right, Skip. He says, you guys did, right? The same people that are here. I say, yeah. He says, all right, well, I guess I better just stay out of your way then. And that was what they needed at that time. But it's interesting that for the most part, people have a leadership style, and you get rid of a leader when that leader doesn't work for his time anymore, and you get another leader when you need a different type of leader. And it goes to why, when we study history, we have this vacillation of who's in and who's out, right? It kind of depends on, well, what kind of leader would we really like right now? Because when Bill Clinton was going through Monica Gate, right, when we were going through all of that, everybody wanted Harry Truman, because that was, you know what, we just want a simple guy who tells the truth and doesn't cheat on his wife. We want Harry Truman back. And, you know, Hamilton and Jefferson, depending on what's going on in the country, and in Broadway, I suppose, one goes up and one goes down. But Washington, again, is one of these rare people who was able to pivot, and he has one kind of leadership style when he's the general. And for those of you who were able to come to the lecture last month and hear Larry Kidder talk about George Washington, and he tells that great story when George Washington says, follow me, and that's his leadership style as a general. He can't do that for this period of time. So he's going to have to transition at the same time the country is transitioning. And again, that's an interesting thing, because another thing I've learned and that I talk to people about is their transitions in a day. You know, when people talk to us at Indispensable Leadership about, well, how do we get more done in our day, what we've really realized is it's you manage your transitions. If you can manage your transitions, you can get things done. Because we've all felt it, right, when we're working and everything's going well, and someone says, you want to come out and have a cup of coffee? And you know that's it, if you go out and have that cup of coffee, because that transition is going to take you out of your thing. So if you go mindfully through these transitions, that's the way you're going to be able to accomplish things. And this was a national transition. We just won this giant war, we won it. And now what do? Well, most people would kind of look back and celebrate. That's why, again, if you look at baseball, football, all sports teams, so few teams repeat, because it's so hard to come back and get that desire again after you've won. And you remember after 2008, Cole Hamels was celebrating for so long that, you know, he was like shocked when spring training came and totally unprepared for it. But you want to celebrate it, you want to enjoy it, and that's what the country wanted to do. But if there's one thing about George Washington, he's always looking forward. Again, a key not just to leadership, but to success in general. You know, Bob Dylan says, "He not busy being born is busy dying." Springsteen talks about glory days, the people who look back and celebrate the glory days. And George Washington, as soon as this war is over, he's looking towards the future. Now, he's been called upon to be the general. He's gone through almost 9 years now, and he's got one promise left to keep after the war has been won. And that promise is a promise he made to himself as much as anyone. And that's the promise that he is going to walk away from power. He is going to be an American Cincinnatus. And he's always believed this. He's always felt this. He's always thought this, because he thinks that's what a republic is. And, you know, he's not a thinker like Madison and Jefferson. He's not an ideologue. He's not deep in that way. He just knows. You know, he feels the fabric of the country, and he knows what's going to work. You know, Thomas Jefferson hates monarchy. Washington doesn't hate monarchy. Washington thinks monarchy is fine in England. He just thinks it will never work in America. It is an un-American institution. It's not going to work. And he is furious when people hint that there's a monarchy going on, especially during his administration and so forth. You know, it's part of this huge split he has with Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson's talking about the monarchy party, and George Washington, if there's anything that you would put #1 on his beliefs at that period, it's that he's opposed to monarchy in America, that he wants nothing to do that, and that he's spent his life doing that. So to hear Jefferson tell people that there's a monarchy party is extremely upsetting to him. But anyway, he's going to do this thing. He's going to retire. And we forget what a big deal that was, because he's going to supplant that in later years when he retires from the presidency. But at the time, it was just as shocking. And those of you who are on our list, I sent you an email with a painting on it that was a painting of this moment, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But, you know, there's this great conversation that King George III has with Benjamin West, who's a painter from Philadelphia. And King George III, in the middle of this portrait being painted, says, "I don't know what the fuss was all about. All you did was change one King George for another King George." And Benjamin West says, well, George Washington is not going to be a king. He's going to renounce that. He's going to go back and be a farmer. And it's a little unclear what we know what George III says in response. It's a little unclear how he says it. And And when I tell it on my tours, I kind of have, I say that he's very smart, snarky. Oh, well, he must be the greatest man in the world. But what he's quoted as saying exactly is, if he does that, he will be the greatest man of the world. And I think maybe he was dead serious about that. I don't think he really believed Washington was going to do that, but he does believe that if he does do it, that'll be something nobody's ever done. So George Washington is determined to do these things. Now, there have been these possibilities, these opportunities for Washington to take more power. There was the Newburgh conspiracy, which we've talked about, and which I'd be happy to discuss if anyone has any question about it. But basically, the Army is seeking to march on Philadelphia, and they are going to demand their money that they've never been paid. You know, the Army realizes this is our last chance. Now, there's a lot of implications to this, of course. Everyone keeps saying during this war, you know, no revolution ever works so that the people who fight the revolution end up taking over the country afterwards. Something ends up happening. And George Washington is determined that this is not going to be that kind of revolution, that his army is not going to march on to Philadelphia and take over civil control. Washington has been scrupulous about following civilian commands. And you know, it's one of these things when you study this, if it had not been Washington, who else possibly could have been the general that would have listened to John Adams, who's running the War Department, who's never smelled gunpowder? Most people, John Hancock, even though he wasn't really a soldier at all either, but Gates, Lee, I don't think they would have listened to him at all. But Washington was scrupulous because, again, it goes back to his dominant theory, which is this is a republic, and that you follow the civilian control. So anyway, the Army's going to march, the Army's going to do this thing. Washington basically crashes the party on the Ides of March, and he makes that famous speech that he makes that's so affecting, where he uses this, you know, he puts his glasses on when he's reading this letter he's written to Congress for him, and he says, I know you will forgive me, not only has my hair gone gray in service of my country, but my eyes have gone blind. And the Army is just, you know, people are crying. And it's this great moment because we've talked about it before. George Washington was not a good speaker. George Washington couldn't respond when at a tavern they toasted him for being the general. Everybody said, well, there was some confusion and embarrassment, like he really couldn't respond. And it was one of these things he knew, I have to learn to do this, and he found his own way to do it. And so there are a couple of these occasions where he is going to speak, and he's going to change the course of history by the way he speaks. And that is one of those times. Now, he's furious at everybody who participated in this Newburgh conspiracy. And Robert Morris, he's very angry at him. And those of you who are familiar with Philadelphia know where the President's house is, and that was Robert Morris's house. It's the structure that's right across the street from the Visitors Center. And Robert Morris, when Washington comes out for the Constitutional Convention, Robert Morris says, well, of course you'll stay with me, you always have, and Washington doesn't want to. He's very furious at him for taking part in this Newburgh conspiracy. He ends up being talked into doing it, which tells us something about Robert Morris, that he could talk Washington into doing something he hadn't planned to do. But the only person he's somewhat forgiving about is Alexander Hamilton, because Alexander Hamilton says, you know, you're missing the point here. And he starts lecturing Washington. He says, there's two parties. There's a party that's still wrapped up in states' rights. There's this party that still only cares about state control. And then there's this federal county. And if you had allowed us to march in there, then that would have been a blow against the state party people, and it would have been a blow in furtherance of the federal people, of which Hamilton was one, and of which Hamilton knew that Washington was one. Washington tells Hamilton, after he's received this kind of lecture from Hamilton, he says, "No man in the United States is or can be more deeply impressed with the necessity of a reform in our present confederation than myself. No man perhaps has felt the bad effects of it more sensibly. For to the defects thereof and want of powers in Congress may justly be ascribed the prolongation of the war." And he added that all my private letters have teemed with these sentiments. So here we are, we've just ended this thing, and we're breaking into these two parties, and Washington, he's not looking at the war, he's not looking at what he's done, he's looking at the future, and he's saying, here's a problem. You know, we're very lucky we won this war. Could have gone the other way. But if we don't make changes on how our governments are going to be, we're not going to win any future war. And so he's already looking at that. And so as he leaves office, he's going to write a couple documents, and to him, these are his farewell documents. You know, he doesn't realize that he's got this whole second half of events to live through at this point. He thinks he's moving on. And so he's going to write something that he calls Sentiments on a Peace Establishment. And in this document, which he sends to the Congress, he argues that some kind of national army is a necessary precaution for the future. Now, a standing army is the thing that terrifies a lot of people. And it did throughout the whole war. It's why they didn't want Washington to have terms of service for longer than a year. They were terrified. You know, people didn't realize that by pure luck, they'd pick the one guy who was not going to use an army and try to turn things around and grab power for himself, and they'd picked a guy where that was impossible. But they didn't know that, and so they justly had a real fear. Standing armies, everybody has a fear of. England doesn't have standing armies. You know, if you have a standing army and you don't have a war, they generally turn around and there's a civil war. So Washington is saying something that's somewhat controversial by saying even when this war is over, there should be a standard federal army. And he's saying that right off. Washington wrote that, although a large standing army in time of peace hath ever been considered dangerous to the liberties of a country, yet a few troops under certain circumstances are not only safe but indispensably necessary. And he's going to recommend that the general government establish fortifications and a navy to protect commerce in wartime, maintain a base at West Point, block invasion from Canada, and open an academy to train officers. His main concern, though, is about the West. His main concern is always about the West. That's the future. That's where the land is. And how do we control this place? It's got ruffians. It's got, of course, Native Americans. It's part of America, but it doesn't know it's part of America. And Washington wants to buy land out there. He thinks westward expansion is the way of the future. And that's not going to happen unless there's some kind of a federal army. Of even greater importance was what he wrote called a circular letter to the 13 state governments. So as he moves on from being the general, he's going to write this letter of advice to all of the governors of the 13 states. And he says, "It is indispensable to the happiness of the individual states that there should be lodged somewhere a supreme power to regulate and govern the general concerns of the Confederate Republic." Now, Washington's not going to really talk in specifics here. He's going to leave that to others. But the letter called for an indissoluble union of the states under one federal head. So again, this is fairly early to be talking about this kind of thing. Washington is adamant that it was only in our united character as an empire that our independence is acknowledged. It's a really interesting kind of idea there, that South Carolina didn't win it, Virginia didn't win it. We won it as united force. You know, I was listening to WIP today, and someone called in the announcer and said that New York
was the first state capital, and the guy on WIP said, no, it wasn't. The first United States capital. And he said, no, it wasn't. The first United States capital was Philadelphia. So, like, the only thing I found more painful than listening to WIP talk about legal matters was listening to this conversation, which went on a long time as if there was no way to figure out the truth of it. And they said, if someone wants to call in, and I thought, no, I can't call in. But of course, they're totally confused. They will be when they get to the point of realizing that on the Declaration of Independence, it says the United States of America. That was meant as a plural. That was meant that these states are united for this purpose. And of course, we weren't really the United States of America as a singular yet. So anyway, Washington is going to assure him that his words could be trusted because he was relinquishing power, and he would not be taking any share of the public business hereafter. And this is the first time he's made this promise out loud. We've seen him kind of talk about it in private. We know that this was something that he kept in mind to himself, but he's telling everybody, I have a right to say this because I'm not going to be part of this government. I'm not going to be part of this. I've done my bit. I'm going to go back to my vine and my fig tree, as he used to say, and this is for the rest of you. I'm going to write these 2 letters, and I'm going to move on, and I'm going to go on and live my life of retirement. So this, he believes, is his farewell address. He's even more direct in his private letters. To Lafayette, he wrote, "To survive, the United States must form a constitution that will give consistency, stability, and dignity to the Union." To Nathaniel Greene, he wrote, "It remains only for the states to establish their independence on that basis of inviolable, efficacious union, which may prevent their being the sport of European policy." And to his brother John, he wrote, "Competent powers for all general purposes should be vested in the sovereignty of the United States, or anarchy and confusion will soon succeed." He argued that a convention of the people should draft a new federal constitution. So George Washington informs Congress, I would like to resign. So Congress thinks, well, how do we handle something of this magnitude? So of course, who do they go to? They go to Thomas Jefferson. They say, we're going to put you at the head of the committee, and you're going to write a script for this thing, because this seems pretty special to us, so we're going to let Thomas Jefferson write the script, which is a very good idea. And Jefferson's going to write out how they do it. Now, it's going to happen on December the 23rd. And Washington is accompanied by just 2 aides, David Humphreys and Tench Tighem, and he arrives at the Assembly Chamber of the Maryland State House in Annapolis. And Washington enters the Assembly and takes a seat opposite his former aide-de-camp and his real enemy, Thomas Mifflin. He's not a frenemy, he's really an enemy. He was a friend and supporter, and the reason everyone showed up here at Valley Forge and there was no food, because he quit his job, and he left all the food off at the Susquehanna River and didn't tell anybody he was quitting and wasn't getting it transported, and jumped over on the sides of those people who wanted to kick George Washington out of being the general. He was with Conway and the others. So it's kind of an ironic moment here, because here's George Washington and here's Mifflin. Mifflin is going to say, "Sir, the U.S. and Congress assembled are prepared to receive your communications." Washington's hand is shaking as he takes out a paper written in his own hand from his coat pocket, and he says, "The great events on which my resignation depended having at length taken place, I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me." Now he's holding the paper with both hands because his hands are shaking so much. He discusses the trepidation with which he took on the post originally, and he says, "Commanding the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take leave of all employments of public life." At this point, virtually every member of the Congress and the bystanders are in tears. Washington draws his commission from his coat pocket, and he steps forward and he hands it to Mifflin. Now, Mifflin is going to very stiffly read the response, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. And what he reads is this, in Jefferson's writing: "The U.S. and Congress assembled receive with emotions too affecting for utterance this solemn resignation of the authorities under which you have led their troops with success through a perilous and doubtful war. Having defended the standard of liberty in this new world, you retire from the great theater of action with the blessing of your fellow citizens, but the glory of your virtues will not terminate with your military command. It will continue to animate remotest ages." So I think it's good that Jefferson and not Mifflin wrote the response. John Trumbull's going to draw a painting of this. And for those of you who I send emails to who got them, go back when you go home and look at it, because I sent you the painting. It shows Washington, and he's turning slightly right toward Congress, and he dominates the image. He's got a writing crop in his left hand, as if to emphasize the speed with which he's doing this. You know, we've won the war, I'm moving on. And it's pretty true, because he promised Martha he'd get home on Christmas, and this is December the 23rd, and he's in Annapolis, so he probably did have a writing crop in his hand, because he's going to leave pretty quickly. Mifflin is slightly higher than Washington. That's to show the supremacy of civilian control. But he's higher, but he's less commanding somehow. Washington's bigger in its own way. It's a very interesting painting. And in the painting are 4 future presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Up on top is Martha. That isn't true. She was at home waiting for him to get home. So John Trumbull is going to write about what a giant, colossal event this was. He wrote to his brother in Connecticut that the act excites the astonishment and admiration of this part of the world. 'Tis a conduct so novel, so inconceivable to people who, far from giving up powers they possess, are willing to convulse the empire to acquire more. As I've talked to you about him retiring from the presidency, this was a very unusual thing what he just did. Of course, it was done by Cincinnatus. So that could have been the end of the Washington story. Washington writes to Lafayette, "I am not only retired from all public employments, but I am retiring within myself, and shall be able to view the solitary walk and tread the paths of private life with heartfelt satisfaction." And so in one day, he gets back, he's back on Christmas, as he had promised Martha, and he goes from the most powerful man in the country to a citizen locked away in his farm, and almost as if by, design, you have this huge cold spell hit, and the rivers are frozen, and people can't visit him. And so it's almost as if he's gone from this period of action. He has this amazing, affecting scene when he says goodbye to his army. And I think I've told you before, George Washington did not shake hands. He did not believe in that. That to him was an affectation. And on this day, he removes his gloves and he shakes hands and embraces with every single member of the army that was there to say goodbye to him. And now here he is back in Mount Vernon, and of course, nothing's been done for 9 years in Mount Vernon. It hasn't made any money, it's not been run well, and now he's got to worry about trying to fix those problems up. Jefferson had this to say about Washington at that time: "The moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish." His plantation keeps him busy. He says, "An almost entire suspension of everything which related to my own estate for near 9 years has accumulated an abundance of work for me." And he said, "I made no money from my estate during the 9 years I was absent from it, and I brought none home with me." Still, worrying about his estate or his farm is very different from the worries he had before about his men and about the war. And he wrote to Henry Knox and said, "It was not till lately that I could get the better of my usual custom of ruminating as soon as I waked in the morning on the business of the ensuing day, and of my surprise, after having resolved many things in my mind, to find that I was no longer a public man, or had anything to do with public transactions." He's only 51 years old, though. And everybody else his age, they're jumping into the action of the times. Benjamin Franklin, much older than him, George Clinton, Hancock, Sam Adams are jumping into offices. John Adams is clearly interested in becoming involved, but not George Washington. He says, I am in length become a private citizen of America on the banks of the Potomac, where under my own vine and my own fig tree, from the bustle of a camp and intrigues of a court, I shall view the busy world in the calm lights of mild philosophy. I am not only retired from all public employments, but I am retiring within myself. When Lafayette urged him to return to public affairs, Washington wrote that he would never be a statesman, describing a statesman as someone whose watchful days and sleepless nights are spent in devising schemes to promote the welfare of his own, perhaps to the ruin of other countries, as if the globe were insufficient for all of us. His only goal, he said, was to tread the paths of private life with heartfelt satisfaction. Envious of none, he wrote, I am determined to be pleased with all. And yet, his private letters show that he is not pleased with the direction the country is going. He complains about Congress's lack of authority, about the failure to pay public creditors. To Virginia Governor Benjamin Harrison, a man who is a strong believer in states' rights, Washington wrote of his desire for expanded national power. He said, I have no fears arising from this source, meaning federal power, in my mind, but I have many and powerful ones indeed, which predict the worst consequences for a half-starved, limping government. After 9 months at Mount Vernon, Washington rides out west to inspect his lands in Western Virginia. And that's when he finds out, much to his dismay, they've never heard of George Washington or the United States. And he finds one of these places where there are these people living, and he says, well, I own this land. And they say, you know, you and what army, basically? Get out of here. And so Washington kind of argues with them about it, and then they say, there's nothing you can do about it. And he pulls out this silk handkerchief in front of these people he calls ruffians. He says, I will have control of this land as surely as I hold this garment. Which he did after he filed a lawsuit, since the judge was somebody he knew who had been a signer of the Declaration. He realizes that we're going to lose the whole West if we don't have a government. And then there are other problems as well. He's going to start pushing for a canal. He wants to create this canal that's going to link the Potomac and the Ohio rivers. And this idea of the canal, it's another way of talking really about bringing the country together, using transportation, going into the future. And he's going to start writing to everybody about this. One is going to write to him. Jefferson, you know, everyone in Virginia wants this thing, and Jefferson writes to him, and he says, we must, in our own defense, endeavor to share as large a portion of this modern source of wealth and power that is offered us from the western county. And then he has a question. You have retired from public life, but would the superintendence of this work break too much on the sweets of retirement and repose? And then stressing how much help this would be in uniting Virginia with the West, he makes what he hopes is his killer argument. He says, what a monument of your retirement would it be? Washington wrote back telling Jefferson first that my opinion coincides perfectly with yours regarding the plan, and that there were immense advantages in which the country would derive from the measure. So he is in terms of that, and he's going to write a lot of letters to a lot of people. Now, there is an issue greater than that one, though, and far more controversial, and that is whether to create a new federal constitution. Now, we've seen that Washington's already brought this up in the past. It's his old friend John Jay who's going to be the first one to bring it up to him. He says to Washington, experience has pointed out errors in our national government which call for correction, and which threatened to blast the fruit we expected from our tree of liberty. An opinion begins to prevail that a general convention for revising the Articles of Confederation would be expedient. I am fervent in my wishes that it may comport with the line of life you have marked out for yourself to favor your country with your counsels on such an important and single occasion. Again, Washington is being asked to step out of the retirement and to help guide the country. Washington truly sees what a slippery slope this would be. Because if Washington involves himself with making a new government, it's almost certain that Washington is also going to have to be involved with being in this new government. That would mean that his retirement was over. And it might mean that his reputation would suffer. You know, he had promised not to be part of any further government. He had promised to go away from these kind of things and to go away from power. So Washington responds to Jay that he agreed with his assessment of what was necessary. But this did not mean that the people were ready for such a dramatic move. He writes, "Ignorance and design are difficult to combat. Out of these proceed illiberality, improper jealousies, and a train of evils which sometimes in Republican governments must be sorely felt before they can be removed." While stating that something must be done or the fabric must fall, Washington added, "I scarcely know what opinion to entertain of a general convention. That it is necessary to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation, I entertain no doubt, but what may be the consequences of such an attempt is doubtful." You see, everything is going the other direction. Every time they try to create more power in the Congress, they fail. And there's a brilliant book about the Constitution called The Framers' Coup. And that's a great title because the vast majority of people have no desire for a federal constitution. All of the state constitutions very jealously guard their own states' rights. And every time you try to give Congress even a little more power, it's a catastrophe. It doesn't work. And so Washington feels, yes, we should have this Constitution, but he looks around and says, there's no way. We can't even get people to agree to let Congress have any kind of tax or to be involved in treaties. How on earth are we going to have a federal Constitution? So it's one of the things that people don't quite ever get taught about how unlikely the creation of this Constitution was. Because if you look at it, it was probably far more unlikely than winning the war. And that was why John Dickinson was opposed to independence. It wasn't because he didn't think we could win the war. John Dickinson's concern was, well, what after we win the war? Now we don't have England. We're all going to probably fight against each other. It's going to be a mess. We can't be independent. That was John Dickinson's concern, and now that's Washington's concern. He's looking around and he says, yeah, we need a constitution, but the people don't want it. There's nothing we can do about that. Many of the great heroes of the Revolution are adamantly opposed to any kind of constitution. Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, they view any constitution as a violation of the very purpose of the Revolution. It's the antithesis of what they fought for. And if you're living out in South Carolina, does it make any difference if you've got a capital that's in New York or it's in London? Not really. You know, these are people that usually don't go 20 miles away from their home. Once again, we just fought this war. We fought it for 9 years, and we're going to have some foreign people who are going to be making decisions on our lives. Well, we're going to have Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is another of these things that is really not taught truthfully. You know, what we hear is that, well, you had this rebellion, they took over the courthouse, which is true. They took over the courthouse because Massachusetts had the most conservative of all of the state constitutions because John Adams was involved in making it. All of the other state constitutions were extremely liberal, and when I say liberal, what I mean is they're very supportive of debtors' rights. They're very supportive of paper money, not necessarily connected to specie. And what's going on, really, is that most of these debtors fought the war and never got paid. And so a lot of these constitutions, they're against the landlords trying to kick these people out, and they're for the people trying to get the people, they're for the people who are trying to hold on. You pay me something, you pay me $200 in money that's connected to gold, I pay you back in paper money connected to nothing. You're really not getting back what you paid me. So these constitutions are not good for the elite, probably not good for economics, and a lot of people are very concerned about it and say, you know, if we keep going this direction, we're going to swing all the way back. We're going to end up with a monarchy, or we're going to end up with a Caesar is going to show up. You know, we can't have all these crazy constitutions. Now, what happens with Shays' rebellion is that after the rebellion, they happen to have an election soon after that, and all of the more conservative people are replaced by people who supported Shay. And they pardoned him, and so the elite people and people who are looking down the road are thinking, well, you know, we've got the animals running the zoo here, and this guy just did this illegal thing against the laws of his own state, and they're condoning it. And Massachusetts was the only one of these governments that had a constitution that they felt was at all useful. George Washington is extremely upset by Shays' rebellion, and he's mortified, and he talks about it to a number of people. And now people start talking more seriously about a constitution. And what happens is people such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are fighting for this thing, and they're going to create, again, Annapolis jumps into this story, an Annapolis convention where they're trying to get some minor more power to Congress, and it's a disaster because there's not a quorum, not enough of the states show up. And so, again, you know, we've talked about the fact you never know if an event's good or bad, right? Hamilton and Madison say, well, we got to turn this into something, or it just looks really bad. And they said, well, let's just announce that we're going to have a federal constitutional convention in Philadelphia, that we were here to decide that, and maybe people will forget that we showed up and we couldn't do anything because a quorum didn't show up. So they make this announcement, okay, we're going to have a federal constitution. Well, how do you have the power to have a federal constitution? Doesn't Congress have to make that decision? Who are you, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, to decide we're going to have a federal constitution? Well, they're going to decide to do that. And it's at this time George Washington is going to start cultivating a relationship with James Madison. And what he's going to do is start entering into a series of letters with Madison where they talk about the political realities, and they talk about what can actually be done here, okay? And by the way, we've got James Madison in the house today. We've got Kyle Jenks. You can go talk to him afterwards. He is the best James Madison performer in the country. And, you know, he's been studying Madison for about 8-9 years, and so go talk to him. He knows more about Madison than anybody. But Washington, you know, Madison, if he were alive today, it's possible that people would say that he was on the spectrum. You know, people did not, which is why Kyle does him so well. But it's why people do not get good first impressions of James Madison. But as you get to know this guy, you find out, wow, this guy is the smartest guy I've ever met. And Patrick Henry figures that out, and Thomas Jefferson figures that out, and George Washington is figuring out. This is the guy who's really thought these things through. And when you study Madison, it's fascinating. He'll write 30-page memos that he never shares just with himself. just to figure things out. So you don't want to debate Madison on anything, because you bring something up and Madison's remembering the 30-page memo he wrote. And so the more you get to know him, the better you like him. Well, Madison realizes his dream of getting a constitutional convention together requires that George Washington be a part of it. It's just impossible. This is going to work if George Washington isn't here. Okay, first of all, Congress hasn't said it's okay. And if we show up, probably we're not going to get a quorum again. So James Madison asks George Washington, can you come to this convention? And Washington says, oh, you know what, I can't. I had a thing with the Society of Cincinnatus, and I told them I can't come, and I can't insult them, and he comes up with a bunch of excuses. So Madison says, okay. And then he writes out a letter to everybody, and he says, yep, Washington's coming. So he took Washington's no as a deferred yes. And he realizes it's not going to work if Washington's not here. Everyone trusts George Washington. They won't think we're trying to steal power if Washington's here, because they know Washington could have marched on Philadelphia, and he never did. We have to have Washington. So now we all have to work on Washington to get him there. And so Madison starts writing to all the other Virginians, you got to write to Washington. And Washington's agonizing over this. He's got pros and he's got cons. The cons, he promised not to get back into politics. He might hurt his reputation. The convention might be an embarrassment. He might show up. Well, it's kind of the chicken and the egg. It's definitely going to be an embarrassment if you don't go. But if you go, maybe it won't be an embarrassment. Maybe it'll work. Madison is going to put together a document that he shares with Washington, which just describes the crisis, that he calls it, that we're in, and all of the problems with the Articles of Confederation. He says that you've got to be involved in this thing. Washington replies that it is out of my power to do this. You know, I told the Society of Cincinnatus I couldn't come to Philadelphia. How can I come? It'd be embarrassing. So Washington, again, he's going to write to Edmund Randolph. He's going to write to others. Meanwhile, everyone's kind of waiting around, and Congress is trying to decide, well, what do we do about this thing? And they decide, finally, you know what? We're not going to agree to it. We're just going to announce that this is happening as if we came up with this. Because really, we're the only people who can do this. So it's kind of going to happen anyway, so we're just going to kind of say, we're having this convention in Philadelphia. But they're going to do something else. They're going to say that this convention is for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So they're going to try to limit it. You know, much like Madison in later years is going to limit the Bill of Rights by taking it over and keeping it down to 10. They're going to say, okay, we're going to do it, but we're going to define it. And we're not allowing them to show up and just create this new Constitution. We're going to say, all you can do is revise the Articles of Confederation. Now Washington is wavering, and he writes to all of his old friends, military people, the people he respects the most. And they all tell him, don't do it. Knox tells him, don't do it. David Humphrey says, don't do it. Knox wrote, if the people have not wisdom and virtue enough to govern themselves, or what is the same thing, to suffer themselves to be governed by men of their own election, why then I must think it is vain to struggle against the torrent. It is vain to strive to compel mankind to be happy and free, contrary to their inclinations. David Humphreys wrote that, I am as confident as I am of my own existence, that due to its limiting mandate and how the states instructed their delegates, nothing important can come of this convention. John Jay is also doubtful. So it's Washington alone among all of his old friends who is thinking more optimistically about this now. He's starting to think maybe this thing could possibly work. And again, like we talked about last month, crossing the Delaware. He's almost at the same point in his mind. If we don't do this, this is going to fall apart. So we need to take a shot at this. You know, Knox and Humphreys, they're looking at Washington's reputation, and they're saying, you're going to risk your reputation here. And Washington feels that, but at the same time, if they don't do this, he thinks the whole experiment's going to fall apart. The whole war will have been for nothing. He decides, he gives kind of a tentative, I'm going to go. You know, he tells Madison, well, if my health can survive, I might go to this thing. So it's kind of like when George Harrison didn't know if Bob Dylan was going to show up for the concert of Bangladesh until he walked on the stage, right? You heard he was coming, but until you saw him. This is what it was with George Washington. Until you see him there, you don't know, because he keeps going back and forth. He's not sure, but he's starting to feel that it's possible. And then he writes to Knox. He says, you know what, I'm going to do this, because I don't think this place is going to survive. This country is going to survive if I don't do it. And Knox then, he becomes enthusiastic about it as well. Washington says, I'm going to find out what I can do, find out what can be affected. Knox is going to respond that if he could devise a new constitution, then Washington would have earned the glorious Republican epithet, the father of your country. And so now Washington and Madison are talking in earnest about what to do. And so Washington, it's going to take him a while to travel from Mount Vernon out to Philadelphia. And people are cheering him as he goes along. And he gets there, and of course, like every one of these things, when he gets there, he finds out nobody else is there, right? Washington's there, Madison's there, and the Pennsylvanians are there. Well, that becomes very fortuitous because they have all this time, because we're going to be weeks before these other guys show up in Philadelphia. So they have time to talk. The first thing George Washington is going to do is he's going to go meet with Benjamin Franklin. Why? Well, now we look at the founders, and there's a lot of people who are somewhat famous, but back then you had two famous people. You had George Washington, you had Benjamin Franklin. And so the question is, which one of these people is going to be the presiding officer? And pretty much everyone agreed. I mean, there was no argument about it. It had to be Washington. Franklin had gout, Franklin had gallstones, all these problems. But Washington's going to do the politically proper thing, and the first thing he does before he even sets his house up is he goes to meet with Benjamin Franklin. And he does that over where the Franklin House is out in Philadelphia, which is no longer a house for those of you who visited. It was knocked down in 1812, but you can see where the house was. And he's going to meet with him. He's going to meet with Madison, who's getting to know Wilson. And Madison's going to put together the Virginia plan. So they're going to start off with this whole plan of a federal government, which totally defies this mandate that all they can do is revise the Articles of Confederation. What's Congress going to do about it? They're just going to do it. So it's very interesting. It's almost like you got a football team who can't score a first down. They can't throw the ball 3 yards, so they're going to throw a Hail Mary. And that's what they're going to do here. They're going to go for the whole thing. They know this is our one chance. The side, we're more organized, thanks to Madison, we're more organized than the other side. They're not going to know what hits them. And George Washington is meeting with these people, but Washington can't take a large role in the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention. And that's because he's going to be the person who, everyone knows he's going to be the leader of the thing. Everybody knows he's going to be the president before they even know what it's going to be called. So Washington is just going to be there. And that's his big thing. The one time he really talks, because this whole convention is done in secret. It's done in secret because people want to be able to talk. They want to be able to talk without worrying about everything being printed in the newspaper. Well, somebody left all of his notes of the Virginia plan on his desk, And Washington came back like General Washington. You know, they'd never seen this guy. And he says, look what I found here. One of you just left this behind cavalierly, which anybody could have come upon, and printed in all the newspapers. Whoever this belongs to, come pick it up. And he slams it down and he marches out of the room. And everyone says, oh. And everyone kind of walks up very carefully to look at it. And the person who writes about this said that, you know, he feels in his jacket and he finds out he doesn't have his notes, and maybe he wrote them, but then he saw it wasn't his writing. And so nobody had the nerve to pick it up. But, you know, in conclusion, what you've got here is a person who had one type of leadership which was very upfront, and then he's going to realize that this is going to require a completely different type of leadership. And everything that he did was letters to people, comments to people, and then he let the situation start to rise until he was requested to come be a part of it. And then he's going to do that. And he realizes, again, he can't be the one to come up with the ideas and the plans except in privacy. You know, he's going to meet with Madison, he's going to meet with these people, and he's going to help do it. But his leadership is a completely different kind of leadership. And then his leadership as president is going to be really a third type of leadership, which I think we're going to talk about next month. Now, the story of the Constitution we're not going to talk about here today, but it's a great story, and the reason we know it is that James Madison, on the very first day he turns his desk around, he wrote everything down. So we have the notes of the federal Constitution that tell us every day, every speech that was made. And for those of you who are interested, I am giving a continuing legal education class on December the 9th, where it's going to be 4 hours, and we're going to go through the entire Constitutional Convention and how it was brought about, who said what, all of that stuff. And it's one of the most interesting stories. You know, there's nothing ever been like this, where you're in here and you're not talking about, let's do things the way this country's doing them. You know, they're talking about Greece, they're talking about Rome, they're talking about philosophy. They're coming up with all sorts of ideas. And I think, particularly in the times we live in right now, where people have only a vague understanding of the Constitution and how it came about, it's very interesting to look at it, and I would certainly welcome any of you, if you can stand sitting in the middle of a bunch of lawyers, to come on December the 9th. We would love to have you. And that's pretty much what I have to say. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have.